Hello and welcome to an unexpected podcast. My name is Tim. With me as always, we have Matt and Mick. Unfortunately, Rainier and Devin won't be with us this week, but Matt's son Evan will be with us later on in the episode. On this week's episode, we're going to be talking about a list from Starfire TM, and we're going to be talking about the scenario Command the Battlefield later on, where Mick, Matt, and later on Evan will go over a list that they each wrote to tell you how that they would kind of build a list around that scenario. But we'll get into the list first from Starfire, so I will move that over to Mick.
Oh, you're sharing. Oh, okay, cool. Okay, so Starfire TM has posted a few days ago an Angmar list of 850 points, which involves Gulliver, Drimmer Lake, Shade, Orc Captain with Shield, 5 Spirits, so I assume these are the Dead March Spectres, 4 Orcs on Wargs with Spears and Shields, so that's throwing spears, 2 Banners, so I assume it would be Orcs with Banners probably, 12 orcs with shields, 12 orcs with spears, and then 5 naked orcs. And he's saying, so with this army, you want Gulliver to be unbeaten in the fight. With the Shade, he'll win the fight against heroes. Heroes will have to spend more might because of the Dwemer Lake. And he's also saying it works perfectly against eagles, dwarves, and humans. The only hard counter is Lady of Light. The Orc Captain gives us 2 might for heroic moves. Because of the 2 banners and the Shade, your orcs win 70 to 80% of normal fights. So you take advantage of that with cheap troops. The Orcs and Wargs and the Spirits are the elite troops, and especially the Spirits can give you an advantage with their abilities. And then he also adds that in his combination, Dwemer Lake is actually strong because he's a good sorcerer with 16 will points, and he can equalize the might advantage of the enemy. And in this list, he claims that Gulliver is overpowered, and he would be usually worth about 400 points. So, okay, so on paper, if you think of putting together Gulliver, Dwemer Lake, Shade into one little ball and just rolling in that ball together and just pushing forward, yes, it will be very, very strong. And orcs with banners supported by a Shade, they're obviously going to be winning most of the fights. However, a lot of the scenarios don't really allow you to do that. So you end up in this situation with these sort of split units whenever you're playing any sort of Maelstrom of Battle, especially scenarios, where you might end up with a Shade somewhere in a corner, Dwemer Lake another corner, Gulliver another corner, and you're not really gaining this big advantage of the ball. The other thing is, I'm not sure how you would be splitting the warbands here. I would probably split them quite evenly, just so everyone can have their supporting warriors as much as possible. But to me, yeah, it just seems like one of those lists which, in the ball, it would be very strong, but outside of the ball, in other scenarios, it might just kind of get very easily picked off in different places. So we talked about Dwemer Lake in our Angmar episode, and I don't think any of us really thought of him very, very fondly. Yeah, he was one of the weaker choices. However, our captain is definitely good. Shade is definitely good. Gulliver is great. So there's potential in this, but yeah, there are several changes I would make. But I'll just pass it over to Matt before making more changes.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the big problem with this. If this army fights in a ball, it's going to be very hard to deal with. But no one in his right mind is ever going to try and fight this ball. They're going to move away from it and basically try and win the scenario without, kind of going after the ball. So even in, something like Contest of Champions, the first thing that's going to happen is the other side's army is just going to run away. And so there are a couple other so there's a couple of things here. The first is I don't think you need 2 banners in this list because one's enough. The problem is not going to be making sure you have enough dice when somebody charges into your death ball. The problem is going to be getting your death ball in contact with the enemy. and I think one banner will be fine. There's a couple things you could spend that 25 points on right off the bat. First is, I think you want to give the Dwemer like a horse. I think you want to give the Orc Captain a warg, so that they have some additional mobility here. I think you could also maybe drop a, I think Spirit is probably Spectre. Drop a Spectre or two and just add some more orcs. And this may even be a list that wants to add some orcs with bows. I've run Angmar lists with some orc bows, and I think they're useful because there are certain situations where even bad shooting is better than no shooting, and right now this list has no shooting at all, which means that it needs to run towards somebody who has like 3 bows. But if you gave bows to maybe those 5 orcs with no weapons there that are sitting at the bottom of this list, then that would at least give you something. And every once in a while, you shoot a guy off a horse, or you plink an occasional list. So against another evil list, you might want just a little bit of shooting to move things toward you. But definitely, you're going to need a plan to make sure that you bring your opponent toward you. And in a bunch of the scenarios, including the one we're going to talk about today, this list is going to struggle. And that's kind of an inherent, I think it's probably an inherent limitation of the list that you're choosing here. I mean, we discussed how Gullivar and the Shade can work together, but that, unfortunately, that places a 6-inch leash on Gullivar when what he really wants to do is kind of leap around the battlefield to different places. Tim, what are your thoughts?
So I was just adding up the points, and the list actually only adds up to 802. So I wonder if he either meant for this to be an 800-point list, or if he's just forgotten some models, but he's about 48 points short.
Well, maybe let's assume in that case it's an 800 points list, because there's 44 models in total, right?
Let's see, 24 plus 10, so 30. Yeah, I think it's close to it. Yeah. So you have a decent amount of models. I agree with Matt. I mean, just a naked orc for you can find a way to add a little use to them, with the bow, because either way they're defense 4. So at least with the bow they can, maybe they get a lucky shot on something and they take out a warg or an enemy horse of some sort. Dwemer, I like how he's trying to, like he said, make it so that it's hard to counter that. But he does, in the new edition, he definitely doesn't have as much use as he did in the old edition. I mean, Gullivar is always great, but like they've been saying, you have to kind of stick this whole thing together. And in missions where you have to spread out, this list will just kind of get, it won't do well when it's not all together. And I definitely don't think you need the second banner. I'd rather use that for more orcs, or something along those lines. But the 5 spirits, that should do. You guys think 5 spirits is too much, or you think it's pretty good?
Yeah, I would say drop down to like 3.
Yeah,
that also gives you like
much.
30 points extra. So if you combine that with dropping 1 banner, that's, let's say, 60 points.
Mm-hmm.
That gives you enough to give your Orc Captain a warg, a horse for Dwemer Lake, and then 40 points of, let's say, orcs with bows, or I would maybe potentially swap one or 2 of the wargs, warg riders, onto just normal wargs, or potentially also get rid of the throwing spears because they're not that good.
Do you guys like the idea
of swear by the throwing spears, by the way? And the throwing spears does give him a little more shooting, and they're not bad on the charge. You definitely, though, I think, do want to put the Dwemer Lake on a horse and the orc on a warg, because if Gullivar needs to leap forward, you can get some extra might near him, and you can get the might sapping zone near him.
Do you guys like the idea of Now, there's very few lists where this is an option. Do you prefer the orc on a warg for the extra points, or do you prefer just 4 wargs who have the same movement but they don't have the knockdown?
I think you want orc on warg because they get the extra. I mean, they're cavalry, so they get the extra attack. They knock down people, and it's strength 4 when you knock people over. So
I think it just really depends on how many models you have and what you're trying to maximize, because I don't think you necessarily need 4 warg riders. I would go, if anything, I would probably go with like 3 or 2. But if I really wanted that extra mobility, then I'd be keen to just like maybe swap 2 of them for just wild wargs, because they're 7 points instead of 12 or even 13, where you're carrying spear and shield on the warg. So you're still getting that extra mobility, but you're not in a situation where your warg riders might just be standing back, unable to do anything, just kind of like waiting to get engaged.
So what do you guys think about the idea of if we took away the second banner with the orcs, so there's 30 points, and then you took away 2 spirits, there's 50. You give the Dwemer like a horse, there's 40. What do you guys think about maybe taking away 1 orc, regular orc, and then maybe adding 5 wargs, so then your army can kind of afford to split up a little bit if it needs to, but then you kind of have the ability to stay in the ball at the same time.
I would say that's too many wargs then.
Too many wargs?
Yeah, because wargs on their own, they're not great for anything other than just moving fast and getting to the objective or running off. And so you really only want like a couple, if anything.
Okay, so would you use most of the points for more orcs themselves?
Probably, yeah.
Okay. Is there anything you think that this list would do, like a scenario in which it would do extremely well at?
Probably Contest of Champions.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, Contest of Champions, I think, would be a good scenario for this list. I think probably also can't remember the name of it, but it's the one with the 4 objectives that are all within 12 inches of the center.
Oh yes.
Capture and Control.
Yes.
That would be a decent one because you can put the ball in the center of the board and then you can kind of take the ball or Gullivar and go in different directions. I think if Gullivar, the Dwemer Lake, and the Orc Captain were all if the Dwemer Lake and the Orc Captain were mounted so that you had this kind of hit squad of Gullivar, the Dwemer Lake, and the Orc Captain for some extra might that could kind of go to each objective in turn, and then some more orcs on some warg riders or some just wargs that could go nip out and grab whichever objective the other guy leaves uncovered. I think that would be a good scenario for this list as well.
All right, and now we're going to move on to the main topic for today, which is the scenario Command the Battlefield. So we're just going to go over the scenario real quick and explain how it works. So basically the game lasts until 1 army has been quartered, and the points for this are you get 1 victory point for each model that has, or you get 1 victory point for each, if you have more models in 1 quarter of that board than the opponent, and you get 2 victory points if you have double the number of models who are wholly within the quarter of a board. You get 1 victory point for causing 1 or more wounds on the enemy leader, and 2 if you kill them. You get 1 victory point if the enemy force is broken, and you get 2 if they're broken and you're unbroken. And it's Maelstrom deployment, so you'll have to roll to see which part of the board you get on. What are your guys' initial thoughts? Actually, let's go over a rule real quick. There's worthless land. The center of the battlefield provides very little tactical value, and so is not much use to either force. Models wholly within 12 inches of the center of the battlefield do not count as being in any quarter of the battlefield for working on victory points. So basically, you want to be as spread out as possible so you can get as many points as possible. What are your guys' initial thoughts about this mission?
Well, you want to be spread out, as you said, and because of how you kind of want to control the whole board and the middle of it is irrelevant, you want to be able to get 2 different places around the board as quickly as possible. So you either have to go with, well, in the ideal world, you would have a lot of warbands who all come up in different parts of the board, outnumber your opponent everywhere, and crush them. Or you would have something that is very mobile in that you're able to come up in less than in one or two of the sides, and then spread around and then just take over different parts. The interesting thing about the victory points in this one, though, is that as long as you're able to have a model in every quarter, then your opponent cannot ever score 2 victory points. Well, actually, it's at least double models, isn't it?
Yeah, double the models
okay,
in the wholly within there.
Right.
Yep.
So thing is, as long as you're controlling 2 of the quarters, you're looking at having a draw. So one of the viable strategies here is to ensure that you have 2 quarters, and then you break your opponent, or you wound their leader. That way, you're able to win, let's say, a 5-4 in case of each of you having a full control of the quarter, and then you gaining the extra breaking or leader point. So that's almost like a conservative way of playing it. If you really want to go for all of the victory points, then you really need to have an army that's capable of spreading and sort of amassing all across the battlefield.
Matt?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about this, and one of the reasons why I find this scenario kind of so much fun, is it turns all of the standard Maelstrom of battle tactics on their head. Because typically in Maelstrom of battle, what you want to do is you want to spend as much might as you can to have your entire army show up in one place, so a piece of it can't get mobbed and killed. In this scenario, that is probably not what you want to do. There are some exceptions to this that I think we're going to talk about in a minute, but typically in this scenario, as Mick said, you want a bunch of warbands that can all fight on their own, and you want them to come in 4 separate places. The other part that's interesting about this is frequently what you want to do in Maelstrom battle scenarios is you want to bring in warbands near the corners, because bringing warbands near the corners of the board means you basically double your chance of having another warband come on near them, because if something comes on the north side of the board and you put it in the corner, then if you get something that deploys in the east-west side of the board, you can still bring it on near them, because you could bring it on kind of in the northeast corner of the board. Here, that's not what you want to do. Here, what you want to do is you want to bring warbands on, if you can, at kind of the cardinal directions on the map. So the center of the north edge of the board, the center of the south edge of the board, the center of the east, the center of the west. And the reason you want to do that is that so you have the option of running to, say if you bring it on in the center of the north edge of the board, you have the option of running to the northeast quadrant or the northwest quadrant, depending on what the opponent's deployment is. Or you can send like the bulk of your warband to the northeast, and then like 1 or 2 guys to the northwest if the other guys' warbands are nowhere near the northwest quadrant of the board. So that's kind of the other tactic that's the opposite of the standard Maelstrom of battle, which makes this scenario kind of interesting. And I mean, the other thing I'd say about this is that the worthless land special rule, I understand why they did this. It makes the scenario work. Obviously, nobody in Middle Earth obviously read Clausewitz in the Battle of the Central Position. The worthless land is, in effect, the most valuable place on the board for this, for high mobility armies. Because there's 2 ways you can win this. If you have a low mobility army or horde or something like that, you want to have warbands coming on from in all 4 quadrants and saying, all right, you need to fight 4 battles in order to beat me, because otherwise I'm just going to soak up 8 points because I'm going to double you all over the place. If you have a high mobility army, what I think you want to do, or at least is a viable alternative strategy, is to come on in one of those cardinal directions and then just take all your cavalry or whatever and just run it to the middle of the board. And once you're in the middle of the board, you can within a turn or two go in any direction you want to. So it forces your opponent to cover all 4 of those because he doesn't know which way you're going to go, and he doesn't know which way you're going to send your force. So that's kind of the alternate strategy, and the way to kind of use the worthless land to make some worth out of the worthless land is to get to the center and then figure out which way to go. Because an army like dwarves that's moving 5 inches a turn and doesn't really have that many guys anyway is really in a dilemma if it ends up fighting a cavalry army in this scenario, and the cavalry army runs to the middle of the board and says, all right, whichever way you send your dwarf, I'm going to send the cavalry to the other 3 places.
So what armies do you think would thrive, and which armies do you think would do not do terribly, but do struggle in this scenario?
So essentially anything that's like mid-tiered in terms of numbers will potentially struggle against hordes or against fast armies, even if they're necessarily elite armies. So for example, if you had something like a 40 to 50 Gondor army fighting against a 40 to 50 Mordor army, then a lot of the time it's going to come down to where you deploy, how you deploy. Like for example, if one person was to deploy in all 4 corners, the other one would decide, okay, I'm going to take three sides instead. Then at least somewhere they would have an advantage, and the 4th side would sort of be there lying and just being a bit useless. But in situations where you have, let's say, a 20 model advantage, like a Goblin town army or like a Moria, then essentially you sort of get to dictate what you do, and the other player sort of has to respond to you, and like you're almost in control. And similarly, as Matt was saying, with high mobility armies, like let's say something like 30 Riders of Rohan at 800 points, you will be able to easily control the battlefield and just sort of decide, okay, well, whatever my opponent does, I'm still able to take initiative, and I'm able to take over the game however I want to.
Yeah, so there's a couple different strategies you can use to build armies to win this scenario, but I think that the armies that are going to dislike this scenario are the armies that have war bands that require them all to be together in order, the synergy armies. So the army we reviewed at the beginning of the episode is the quintessential example of an army that does not want to play this scenario.
It would hate this scenario.
It would hate this scenario because it's got a bunch of war bands, and at least in Maelstrom of Battle, you can try and in most Maelstrom of Battle scenarios, you can try and spend the might to get all of your war bands to show up together. Here, you don't want to do that, and that particular, a ball of death army is going to say, here's my ball of death, come fight me. And its opponent's going to say, no, I'm not. I'm going to go to the other 3 quadrants and just beat you by sitting there. And the person who brought the ball of death army is going to be wailing and gnashing his teeth and saying, why won't you fight me?
Because I actually want to win the game.
Yeah, that's right. So that's kind of the quintessential army that doesn't want to fight this. I mean, there are other ways you can kind of build an army to fight this. I mean, we've talked about obviously the horde tactic. We've talked about kind of the mobility tactic. Another way to deal with this scenario is with shooting. So a shooting army can actually deal with this scenario by kind of it can come in kind of one of the cardinal directions, north, south, east, or west. Spread its army out a bit so that it's got basically its whole army covering 2 of the board halves, and then basically shoot their opponent off of the other ones. And their opponent then needs to come to them. If they've got a couple cavalry figures, they can go in and threaten. But one of the ways you can kind of deal with this is to use shooting to shoot people off of the quadrants that you are not on. And siege weapons, I think, are another tactic for this. They're kind of, I guess, a different category of that shooting ability, because they can shoot anywhere on the board, and in particular the volley fire siege weapons that you just need to get like a spotter that can see somebody. So if you end up in this big battle to fight over one quadrant where most of your army is fighting most of your army, and the other guys put one or two figures on other quadrants to try and get points, the siege weapon is good to kind of basically kill those individual figures off, and get it to the point where either you have more figures on that quadrant than he does, or there's no figures on that quadrant and nobody gets the points for that, and you can win that way. So that's I think a third strategy that's viable.
So would you guys say that Rohan and Rivendell Knights are kind of the kings of this scenario, where they have the mobility and the shooting?
And Goblin Town would be pretty good here too.
Yep, that's true. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, but there's a number of armies that are good here. I mean,
of course.
I mean, Gondor is another good one, especially if you've got Madril, who can help get all of the warbands where you want them. And any type of army that has a bunch of decent warbands that can fight well and can fight well on their own, will do well in this scenario. Because remember, numbers matter. And if you've got Rohan, you've got Rivendell Knights, you've got the mobility, but you don't have the numbers. So, Rohan and Rivendell, if they're forced to like send cavalry in 4 different directions, can struggle against some opponents. So I think Rohan and Rivendell, I think the mobility strategy, the all cavalry strategy, is a way to go, but I don't think it's the be all and end all of winning it. And Wild Evan signs on.
I think it's worth also discussing in this scenario how the game ends when a force has been quartered, rather than a classic 50% and roll dice. Because in scenarios like, for example, Whole Ground, where you also have Maelstrom and you're going towards the center, there is a common strategy where you sort of get to the center first, and then in the meantime you throw half of your army away, and you basically hope that as soon as you get there, the game is just going to end on a roll of 1 or 2. In here, that doesn't apply. So with certain armies, you're actually able to, like if let's say you end up in just 2 quadrants, then it may be a good idea to focus on annihilating whatever else your opponent has in those quadrants, rather than splitting into necessarily all 4. Like if you have like a small dwarf army or a small Rivendell army, then you may want to sort of focus on very specific parts of your opponent, make sure that these are destroyed, and then slowly progress into different quadrants. Because once you break them, you know that the game won't end yet. But thanks to Standfast and thanks to this 25% game end, people are sort of able to control roughly when they want the game to end. So let's say if I have more models in 3 quadrants than you, then even though I'm broken, I may just decide, okay, I'm just gonna fail courage tests, not do my Standfast, or like take my courage tests with my heroes after I've done them with my orcs, and then just end the game right now. So there is a lot of potential play here for knowing how and where and when to take your courage tests once an army breaks.
Yeah, there's also, if you're in a tournament situation and there's a time limit, this is definitely one where you want to be watching the clock, particularly if you've got a mobility army. So you can go in and hang out in the center and shoot for a while, and kind of whittle the enemy's numbers down, and then you gotta figure out what time on the clock you want to then make your bolt for the your bolt for the edges with your cavalry, so that the other guy doesn't have a chance to react to you in time. And there's a lot of fiddling that you want to do too if you've got your, because I think you also want to, when you're fighting these battles, you want to hang out at the cardinal direction points. So like at the junction of the northeast and south and northwest boards, for example. And then when the clock's getting down to the 2-hour mark and the game's going to end, that's when you take a bunch of guys and move them from one quadrant to the other, to make sure that you have the numbers.
I think another thing before we'll get Evan's opinion real quick. But another thing that's really important to keep in mind is you have to have your model wholly within the quarter. So like you need to watch out for that, because you can't have the whole model has to be. And even though this won't be that huge of a deal, and most people should watch out for it and probably will, it is a big deal to make sure that you are fully within that 12 inches or that quarter of the board. I'm sorry, to make sure that you're there so that you don't lose any model points. But Evan, I know you're just joining us now. What is your opinion of Command the Battlefield?
I think it's a very interesting scenario. It's very different from a lot of what we've done before. I mean, I can't really say a lot about it because haven't played it a ton of times. The one time I did against my father, I don't know if you guys have gone over that game yet.
No, because I completely forgotten about it.
Oh yeah. So I guess I can just sort of go over like how it worked and what happened there. So I sort of did a different strategy from what you guys talked about. I took my entire army and I deployed it on one corner, and then he deployed his army sort of a bit more spread out. There was one warband on the other end of the board, and then two who sort of came and engaged me. And correct me if I'm wrong. What's the game end conditions on this scenario?
25%.
25%. So yeah, it was easier for me then, because what that allowed me to do is I managed to break him, kill his leader, because I had more of my army in one spot. And then because I was in one corner, I basically said heroic march one way, heroic march another way, and then I managed to get in, grab three of the corners, and then it ended up winning from there. It's a bit more of a risky strategy than just deploying on one of the cardinal directions and grabbing two board corners, but it allowed me to win a little bit bigger. And if you're confident enough in the ability of your army to defeat your opponent's army in combat, then that might be a strategy you want to go for.
I think what I really like about this scenario is there hasn't been anything like this before, where it's not that it forces you to deploy in different zones, but most armies want to deploy together. And this one kind of says, well, you can do that, but you kind of want to control all four. So if you wanted to split up, it gives the armies that have the ability to break apart in Maelstrom. It usually punishes them for getting apart, but now it rewards them for kind of doing that. But that's just my opinion. I like how it's different from anything we've seen before. Any final thoughts on the mission?
I mean, other than the fact that I think it allows like small armies and large armies to be pretty viable. One, because large armies can do that thing where they split up and they grab all the objectives immediately. But small armies can also, once they've beaten the larger armies, they can go and just grab the objectives. So I think it's a very well balanced scenario in that respect.
I am a big fan of playing as Durin's folk, so I'm very happy that a Maelstrom scenario isn't going to hurt me in this regard. So I'm very excited about that, because as the biggest annoyance when playing dwarves is the ability to not deploy together, and then everybody just takes you out one by one kind of a thing. But this is good. We're now going to move over to list. Everybody, Matt, Mick, and Evan have written an 800-point list. We'll go over to Matt first. So Matt, what was your 800-point list for this scenario?
All right. So for my list, I went with a horde of goblins, because that's the obvious answer to the command the battlefield question. So I have got 800 points of Goblin Town. So I have the first warband, obviously, is the Goblin King. With him are 23 Goblin Warriors and Gollum. This particular scenario is not a list where you want like one figure warband drops. So Goblin's going to run around, make sure that he comes in with the Goblin King where you need him. Warband number 2 is the Goblin Scribe with 12 Goblin Warriors. And obviously its job is just to waddle onto the board and start bringing on goblins in random quadrants where the other guy isn't. And the warband number 3 is Grinna with 18 goblins. Warband number 4 is a Goblin Mercenary Captain with 8 Goblin Mercenaries. Warband number 5 is a Goblin Mercenary Captain with 8 Goblin Mercenaries. Warband number 6 is a Goblin Mercenary Captain with 8 Goblin Mercenaries. And Warband number 7 is just a Goblin Captain with 7 Goblin Warriors to round out the army. So it ends up being 92 models. It has 7 warbands, and it has let's tally up the might here, shall we? It has 17 might.
17, yeah.
Yep.
Is that it?
Yeah, I think so.
No, that just 17 might, 92 models. No big deal.
Yeah. So yeah, the strategy here is you bring the Goblin Scribe on first, and he's going to end up somewhere because he doesn't have any might to affect his die roll. Wherever he comes on, and I think this is a circumstance where you want to put the Goblin Scribe near a corner of one of the boards here, because then you take the Goblin Kings and his warband and granted his warbands, and you spend whatever might you need to get it near the Goblin Scribe and just protect the Goblin Scribe. Because in many ways, the Goblin Scribe is the most important model you're going to have in the game for this particular scenario because of its ability just to feed on goblins in whichever quadrant you need them to appear. The Goblin Mercenary Captains, I think you keep them all in reserve. And the reason I only put 8 Goblin Mercenaries in each warband is because you need to fit the entire warband within a terrain piece. You don't want the warbands to be too large because you want to take advantage of smaller terrain pieces. Now that I'm looking at it, I wonder if you want to maybe have warbands of different size in there. So maybe one with 6, one with 10. To take advantage of different size terrain pieces. Of course, if you can't fit it on, it's not really that big a disadvantage in this particular scenario, just to bring them on one of the board edges. But you want them to be able to show up in various different places around the board. That's what they're for. And they show up later to see where the other guy commits, so you can put them where the other guy's not going to be. And then the Goblin Captain and his 7 goblins are just kind of a distraction force. They can either come on to bolster the big corner that has the Goblin King on it, or can just come on in one of the other different quadrants to give somebody else something else to focus on. So, obviously it's got 92 models plus more arriving with the Goblin Scribe. And this is just I'm going to be everywhere on the board, and you have to go everywhere on the board to try and exterminate me. And you probably won't be able to do that. And that's the way the list works. In many ways, this is kind of Goblin Town's ideal scenario.
Mm-hmm. So I think I already know the answer to this. Is there any army you'd be afraid of playing against with this army? Is there anything that would scare you?
Another Goblin Town.
I was about to say that.
I had a feeling that was the answer, but
yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if there's another army I'd be afraid of playing against this. I think the type of army that would do well against this would be another kind of slightly better horde army, or perhaps a horde shooting army. And maybe something like a Rangers of Ithilien Legendary Legion, with Madril, that gets all its warbands to come on where it wants, and there's a lot of them, and they all shoot, would be, it'd be a problem against this particular army. And to a certain extent, it also depends on how long the game is going to last, because you want to bring this Goblin Town army on, and then you want the game to end as quickly as possible, or as in few turns as possible, so that stuff doesn't die. And in a long drawn out battle against something like Rangers of Ithilien, you can lose an awful lot of goblins from this list really quick. So that would probably be its biggest problem. It's probably got enough numbers so that it can just swamp a cavalry army, and a cavalry army could probably get in and win maybe a quadrant. But then this army would just kind of exist in all the other quadrants and hopefully outpoint it.
Mm-hmm. Thoughts on Matt's list?
Oh, it's strong.
That's. I mean, to be fair, there's not a whole lot to say. I mean, it is probably the best, or one of the best armies to take for this scenario because it doesn't have to stay together. It has a really good leader that's hard to kill, and there's not much you can really do about it. And if Matt wants to hide the Goblin King in the corner to not give up points at some point, you can't really do anything because there's a horde of goblins in your way. I mean, there's nothing you can really do about Goblin Town. It's a fantastic army.
I would say the best way to beat it would be to specifically tailor a list around it, but that's not really what you want to be doing in a random scenario sort of event. So I mean, if you had something like, let's say, a horde Gondor army with like 65, 70 models, and most of them defense 6 and a bunch of rangers, or like, let's say, a Mordor army with like 60 orcs, where you're winning fights because you have slightly higher fight value, and you don't have to engage in all the quadrants, then you might get an edge. But ultimately, those armies won't really do that well on average in other scenarios. Whilst the Goblin Town list, it's kind of the same in whatever scenario you play. So it's always going to be good. So you don't really have to tailor it to anything.
If you saw this scenario in a tournament pack, right?
Hmm.
More than likely, somebody is going to take Goblin Town. And so most of the time, you kind of build your list to fit the scenarios. If you were to come up against, is there a list you try to build so that in case you came up against Goblin Town, you can still do well, but it's meant for a tournament build as well? Is there like a specific army that would do really well against this, like besides the Rangers of Ithilien?
Goblin Town.
Another Goblin. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's not.
So I mean, if I was trying to counter this list, I would, with something other than Goblin Town or Rangers of Ithilien, I would want a siege weapon in my list. And the reason is if you're fighting Goblin Town in this scenario, the most important piece to take off the board early is the scribe. Because the scribe is what can cause Goblin Town to win this scenario in a late game, because it just keeps bringing on guys in the quadrants that you thought you already cleared out. So you want to take him out, and you got two options. You can either bring your guys on whichever quadrant he shows up in, assuming that you deploy second. If you deploy first, you're kind of out of luck in that scenario. Or you can have the ability to kind of shoot that thing down, and the easiest thing to shoot it down with is a siege weapon, because it can tag it from anywhere on the board.
As Mick always says, take 3, and then that way you're really covered.
I'm not sure you take 3, because then I'm not sure you have enough bodies to do what you need to do.
Just let me dream, okay?
Okay.
Let me dream.
All right.
Okay, so I guess that's pretty much it. I mean, there's not much to talk about with Goblin Town. Mick, what was your list?
So yeah, I took the opposite, just so we can disagree. But on here, I took the Rivendell Knights. So I have Elrond fully geared up, 17 knights with shields, 1 knight with shield and banner. And then there are different schools of thought what else you should take with them, because that adds up to 620 points. 610. So I decided to go for Strider mounted with armor and bow, just because of his ultimately infinite might points and infinite heroic marches, which might be pretty useful here. So unlike Goblin Town, unlike a lot of other lists, this is one of those places where it kind of wants to be in a ball because there's so few of them, and also you only really have one warband, and then Aragorn ideally jumps in to join that one warband. So they're going to be relying heavily on shooting, and they're going to be relying heavily on either trying to sort of assassinate warband by warband and then maybe run away and then jump onto something else, kill it, run away, jump onto something else, and like slowly butcher through around the edges. Or they might just go in the center and try to shoot and pick things off. Because ultimately, if let's say you're sitting in the center and you're playing against something like a Goblin Town or like another big horde, then that army doesn't necessarily want to come close to you in the center, because if let's say you are getting close to 25%, well, as long as as soon as your opponent's army breaks and they're in the center, then your heroic marches allow you to just pounce out onto various quadrants and just leave them stranded in the center. So you may end up playing this weird kind of mouse situation where, okay, well, I'm in the middle, come get me, but if you come and get me, then your models don't count for the quadrants. So this army will obviously play differently against every opponent. Like if you only outnumbered me by 10 or 15, then chances are I'll just pounce onto things and then run away and then pounce onto other things, just like slowly chop off various parts of my opponent's army. If they're all standing in a ball, then so am I, and I'm shooting. Hopefully there's not more bows, and hopefully I'm not just forced to charge. And yeah, against very big lists, it's going to be one of those tricky situations of how much can I commit, how much can they commit, can I shoot, can I break them? Like there will be a lot of factors and to think about, and a lot of terrain to think about. So it will play differently against everybody. But I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a favorite against a horde or something like that in this sort of scenario. So it's not the best scenario for a list like that, but it's not the worst either.
So, what would it at 800 points? You're probably going to see other armies that can shoot.
Yeah.
How exactly? Let's say you come up against like a Harad army where they have 50% bows.
Mhm.
How are you dealing with that, knowing that they outshoot you?
Well, so all of my bows are in one place generally, and a Harad list may end up in a situation where some of their bows are here, some of their bows are there, some of their bows are north, south, east, west, and so with free heroic marches, I'm able to basically set myself up into a situation where my 18 bows are shooting against, let's say, only 5 Harad bows. And then if I'm able to stay stationary at some point, I get the rerolls to hit, although I wouldn't necessarily be relying on that much in this scenario. But you're able to sort of find these spots where you're actually able to outshoot your opponent, even though in general they might have more bows, but you should be able to put yourself into these spots around the board. And ultimately, if you know that you're being heavily outshot, then you just go somewhere where your force is going to be much more powerful than your opponent's force. So let's say if my opponent only has like a warband or 2 in one place, then this is whole army fighting as a 1 or 2 warbands. So you can just pick them off and then go back and go somewhere else.
Yeah, I think Strider's the right ad for this list, just because he does give you that mobility and that extra point of might every turn because you're to call the heroic moves and the heroic marches to go where you need to go. I mean, the other answer to the Harad list in this is, because Harad is foot bows, Harad against the Rivendell Knights needs to decide whether it wants to kind of deploy all in one place or deploy in different places. And if it chooses to deploy in different places, then you're probably not shooting. You're going to go and charge in and butcher, the contingent in one place. And then when he kind of masses his bows against you, you move to a different place and try and butcher what's there. And Strider really gives you the mobility to do that.
Now, let's say you had a army that, let's say, had a third bows. So let's say a Gondor army. And let's say they averaged about 15 bows, and they all kind of deployed together on like one half of the board. So they chose, let's say, the north and the eastern board edges, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they decided that we're going to take this half and we're going to go forward and we're going to try to shoot you. If all their bows are focused in one area, how would you deal with that? Would you just try to call it heroic? Do you have the ability to call heroic shoot?
I think so. Yeah, I think Aragorn
has it.
Free heroic shot. Yeah.
Yeah, he has all of the heroic.
Yeah,
okay, so would you just call heroic shoots and try to get them off as quickly as possible?
I mean, sorry. I mean, everyone has free hero shot.
Okay.
No, as in like all heroes are able to call heroic shoot.
Oh, that's right. I'm thinking
Right,
of
it's
accuracy.
heroic
I'm thinking of
accuracy.
accuracy. Yep,
Yeah,
that's my
heroic
fault.
accuracy. That's right. Yeah. So well, if they put everything in just one spot, then your 15-inch movement means you just go to the other spot where there are no bows. So
Mhm.
it's just one of those situations where in this scenario, if your opponent was to deploy all over the board, then you get the choice of, okay, do I just stun and shoot, or do I just pick out bits of them? It's similar to playing like an all-hero army, where let's say you have only 5 or 6 models, but all of them are much more powerful. So it's almost like, okay, well, your warband is 200 points, my warband is 800 points. So obviously my warband will crush yours. So if you've deployed in different places, then the strategy is to just pick off those bits. If you deploy together, then the mobility still allows you to find bits around the board where you're able to shoot and they might not be able to shoot. Or you might be able to charge in with, let's say, Elrond and Aragorn, do a couple of heroic combats and maybe just like run away. So there's always just bits where you can be doing stuff and still be out of major danger.
And I mean, there's always the typical cavalry bow versus foot bow tactic of, especially if you're hiding your bows in the second rank. If you've got the Rangers behind the warriors of Minas Tirith, you put your cavalry so that only the warriors of Minas Tirith are in range, and the Rangers are impotent a half inch at a range and shoot there. I mean, this is definitely an army though where you need to keep a close watch on the clock, because there's going to be a certain point when you're going to look down and say, all right, at this point, Strider just needs to call the march and get the exact right number of cavalry figures in the right quadrant, because this is going to be the last turn of the game.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I guess honestly, just as they already said, mixed list is the exact opposite of my father's, but they both work extremely well in this particular scenario. My father's is more, you just throw them on the board, you throw them in the objectives, and then you just die, and there's not a ton of thought
You die
behind it.
slowly.
Oh, you're Goblin Town, so I don't know if you're going to manage that, but it doesn't really matter.
It's slowly as a percentage.
Sure. And then mix is definitely a lot more complex to play, but it's like no less powerful in this particular scenario, because I mean it outmaneuvers basically every single army in the game except arguably Rohan because of Gamling's banner. And if the army that you're fighting against chooses to split up, then he just runs around killing each individual part and just murdering the army, and then grabs the objectives. If it stays together, he either shoots them to death or just runs around and grabs the objective and eventually wins. So unless he is literally playing against Goblin Town, there's basically a way for him to win in most matchups against any other army.
I have one more final question, and we'll move on to Evan's list. Mick, how would you deal with blinding light at 800 points with your list? If they were all to deploy together, and they had blinding light like Gandalf or Galadriel, how would you deal with that?
Well, if they were all together, then they would control maximum of 2 quadrants.
Mm-hmm.
Then I could control the other 2 and either stay back and force a draw,
Okay.
or depending really on how they're deployed in their ball, because essentially there are situations where if, let's say, you are second to move and you charge in, it's just one of those classic cases of, if the cavalry charges in second and you have your big heroes calling multiple heroic combats, you're able to cause a lot of damage on your charge, and then because of how many knights you have, next turn, even if your opponent charges you first, you then get to countercharge and flank around with your knights. So the Rivendell Knights list has this sort of quite a unique position where even though your opponent might be charging you, you're still counter-charging and you're still fighting pretty well because you have a banner nearby, you have your Aragorn, you have your Elrond. Even if let's say your Elrond isn't necessarily charged, there is always a Nature's Wrath possible. So yeah, the Blinding Light is always a tricky one. Well, which is why also at the beginning I said that there are two schools of thought on what should go into a Revenant Knights list. One is someone like Aragorn or Glorfindel who gives additional fighting power, or someone like Gandalf or Galadriel sometimes, who provides blinding light for yourself as well. And so I don't think there is a wrong answer there. They do different things in different ways. But yeah, fighting against blinding light is tricky, but there are ways around it.
Yeah, I mean, especially in this particular scenario where just running out of range of your opponent is a perfectly viable option because the blinding light can only go in one direction. And you know, to a certain extent, I mean, if the other guy has blinding light but doesn't have a significant number of bows, then that doesn't really help them all that much because 18 Rivendell Knights that hit on 6 is still going to do enough damage to force you to have to run after them. And if they have blinding light and enough bows, then Mick says, "All right, I'm going to go over to these other 3 quadrants," and you can be there with your blinding light, and that's just fine, and and I'll win on points.
Okay, we'll move on to Evan. Evan, what was your list?
Okay, so I decided to make a list that wasn't as extremely oppressive as the last two lists in this particular scenario, but it's still pretty solid. So I've got Shadow Lord on Fellbeast. He's with 6 Black Numenorians, 4 Orc Warriors with Spears and Shields, 1 Orc Warrior with Spear, Shield, Banner, 1 Orc Warrior with Spear, and then an Orc Tracker and a Warg Rider with Shield. And then the Mouth of Sauron on Armored Horse with 6 Black Numenorian Warriors, 6 Orc Warriors with Spears and Shields, 1 Warg Rider with Shield, and then Gurrett's Master of the Reserves, 5 Black Numenorian Warriors, 2 Orc Trackers, 5 Orc Warriors with Spears and Shields, and then from the Dark Denizens of Mirkwood, the Spider Queen, and a Bat Swarm. So the thought process behind this list is, 1, it's got Gurrett's Master of Reserves. So generally, it's going to be deploying wherever it wants to deploy. And also it's got 10 might, so it's not really that bad in that department either. It combined with Gurrett's Master of Reserves rule, you're basically going to deploy wherever. Black Numenorians are super solid. They're not going to die to a lot of troops. Defense 6 is good. Terror is great, especially with the -1 from the Shadow Lord. The Orc Warriors have shields just in case I need to split up and cover as much ground as possible. And if they want to sit there and shield, then it allows them to be more defensive. Shadow Lord on Fellbeast is super maneuverable. The Spider Queen is super maneuverable. Broodlings are broken, especially in objective scenarios where literally I could be across the board from an objective, and if I move the Spider Queen full, drop a couple broodlings, and then move the broodlings, I now control that objective. Obviously, Bat Swarm is amazing too because it flies. And then it's 44 models in total, so it's not a small army. It's a decent sized army. And I mean, other than that, it's just a general army. And I think this army would probably be a lot more effective in not just this scenario, but other scenarios. And it's not as polarizing as the last two lists, because the last two lists maybe wouldn't do as well in other scenarios. But this one is overall very solid, but it's also got a ton of tricks to it that can allow it to basically turn the game around at any point.
Now,
Gurrett's,
oh, sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to ask if Gurrett's special rule affects the Spider Queen, or is it only
Yes,
Mordor?
everyone in the
Yeah, it
army.
affects
Everyone in
everybody.
the
Unlike
Yep.
Madrigal.
I think Madril's may as well, if I'm not
No,
mistaken.
Madrigal's only affects Minas Tirith.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Evan, how exactly would you deploy this army, and what would be your intention with it?
I mean, it depends, I guess. It depends on what you're trying to do. If I was deploying against something like Mix, I'd probably just pick a cardinal direction and deploy into objectives and play for the draw because he utterly outmaneuvers me. If I was playing something like my father's, it's a little more tough because the plan is kill him as much as possible and then somehow stop him from getting to 25% for as long as possible and then just grabbing the objectives. So I think maybe deploying on a cardinal direction as well might be best just to try and scrounge as many points as possible. Just to get in a good position to maybe if I get the break in the leader, then it'll end up working out in my favor. But they'd both probably be pretty tough matchups. But I wouldn't be surprised if the player of this army list is skilled enough that they could maybe make an upset over either of these.
So, I assume you're going to want the Spider Queen to kind of follow the Shadow Lord around, or the Shadow Lord to follow the Spider Queen around, one way or the other, so that the Spider Queen doesn't get pin-cushioned.
Yeah.
I wonder what's the order of Warband deployment? I mean, Master of Reserves first. Do you bring the Spider Queen on and then spend the might from the Shadow Lord if you need to, or do you bring the Shadow Lord on first and spend the might from the Spider Queen if you need to get her in the same place as the Shadow Lord?
I think the general idea would be to deploy the two bulkier warbands first with the Mouth of Sauron and the Shadow Lord, just because one, they have less might, and two, they are less maneuverable than the Spider Queen's warband. Because the Spider Queen moves 10, moves over all terrain pieces. The Bat Swarm moves 12 and moves over all terrain pieces. So I'm not as worried about where they go as long as they're in the general proximity of where I want them to be. And also, she is 3 might. The other two warbands have 2 might.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Nick,
So,
any thoughts?
I have a question. So if let's say you were playing against Matt's list and you were to, well, if you two played against each other and Matt was to win the role for deployment and he was to deploy first, how would you, Matt, deploy your warbands knowing what Evan has just said and knowing that he will be deploying second?
So I think what I do is I bring the scribe on where, and he's just going to go wherever, and wherever he's going to end up where he ends up. Hopefully I can put him in a corner. And then once I do the scribe, I think I bring everything in around the scribe that I can, spending what might I need to in order to do that. And I make sure that I have enough goblins so that I can kind of wall off the board so that nothing can come in near the scribe and like come in behind him. And I keep all of the mercenary captains in reserve because I want them to come in wherever Evan is not. And then the captain's just going to come in wherever he comes in. And I think probably I put the captain someplace else just as a distraction, in some random place, probably as far away from the goblin scribe as possible, so that if Evan wants to go after him, he's got to commit stuff far away from the goblin scribe. And then I go from there and I say, hey, look, I've got my 60 goblins, Goblin King and guy with the ring standing here. Come and get me.
And so the question, vice versa, if Evan, if you were to deploy first, would you then deploy in a ball too?
If I were to deploy first, I would be screwed. But I would definitely want to deploy in a ball because at least that allows me to not have my entire army get murdered by swarms and swarms of goblins. Um, Unfortunately, it's going to be challenging for my list to win the scenario against my father's. But I think obviously priority number one, Shadow Lord goes up to Goblin Scribe, black darts him as much will as possible, takes him off the board. And then priority number two, I'd say my chances would be much higher if this game ended on a random roll of a one or a two after breaking. But because it ends at 25% and because goblins run so much after they're broken, this immediately after the goblins are broken, like the turn after, the goblins will be 25% and then the game will be over, and there's not much I can do about it. At least if it ended on a random roll, then I may have a chance to get enough turns to be able to just beat up his army and then grab the objectives. Um, I guess the desperate bid would be to get at least one model on every board corner in order to deny as many points as humanly possible, and then try and kill the Goblin King, which is challenging because I don't have any Elven Blades or anything like that. And break him, which should be less challenging because I have two monsters that can do a bunch of hurls, and I have a bunch of terrifying guys that can sort of just walk through his goblins.
Remember, the Shadow Lord's Black Dart only has a 6-inch range.
Yes. Again, it would be tougher, but hopefully he'll be able to manage. And also, if need be, I can just chuck as many hurls at the scribe as possible to try and kill him. Because what is he? Defense 3, 1 fate?
He has 1 fate. He is defense 2.
Nice.
Well, either way, it would be wounding on 4s with hurls, 3s with black dart. So all you really need is 1 and a bad fate roll, and then he dies. But it would still be challenging.
So I'll ask the reciprocal question. Mick, assuming you deployed first and
I
you
deploy
were
in a ball.
playing against Evan, yeah. So you would deploy in a ball. I mean, you've got basically 2 war bands.
One.
And
Really.
what do you do? What do you do on the first turn of movement?
Well, I deploy all together, ideally, and run myself somewhere towards the center, somewhere where I'm not going to be easily charged from behind on turn 2. If, let's say, he was to deploy his entire army just behind me and then heroic move and charge in. The other alternative would be to deploy myself somewhere in a corner and put knights in such a way that he can't just come in from behind. But I think I would probably just run forward 10 inches and set myself up for potential close combat battling from turn 2 and hope that his rolls roll badly and he doesn't just deploy his entire army just next to me.
And I'm assuming you deployed first. What would you do against Mick?
I mean, I would deploy in a ball as well. The same thing would happen if I didn't. That would happen with your list is Mick would just sort of deploy against one warband and then murder the entire thing and then just sort of run off. Deploying in a ball at least allows me, if Mick wants to fight me, which he probably doesn't because I get 1 hurl off and I kill half of his army, then at least then he won't be able to hurt me that badly. I mean, I guess if he deploys first, It's lucky that that old rule where you can compel somebody into combat on turn 1 doesn't exist anymore, because immediately the Spider Queen would go in, call a heroic combat, and just knock out like 6 or 7 or 8 knights, and
Yeah,
then
that rule
just run
sucked.
away.
That rule never should have been invented.
Yeah, that was quite interesting when it did exist.
Well, I mean, it wasn't technically a rule. It was the absence of a rule to the contrary.
Yeah.
So,
All right. Now I'm going to do a list that I had made. And it has 52 models, and it has 11 might. It also has 2 heroic strikes, which I always try to get in there. It is the Undying on horse with 5 Moranians with shields, 5 Moranians with spears and shields, 2 orc trackers, and an orc drum. Gothmog on warg with shield, 5 Moranians with shields, 5 Moranians with spear and shields, 2 orc trackers. Gorbag with shield, 5 Morans with shields, 5 Morans with spear and shields, 1 orc tracker. Guritz, 5 Morans with shields, 5 Morans with spear and shields, and 2 orc trackers. So I end up getting, like I said, 52 models because I have 47 troops and 5 heroes because of the orc drummer. The main point with this is that, like Evan's list, I can deploy wherever I want with my army, and then with the drum having the 12-inch range, I can kind of move 9 inches wherever I want, and if I really need to, I can use Guritz to move with that, so I can move 12 inches in a turn. So if I really need to get somewhere, I can move quickly with it. Obviously, that only affects 6 inches each way, but if I really needed like a specific group of people to move forward, I can. I've got the Undying so that you won't get any leader points off me, because you can't. The only way you can get any points off leader is to literally kill the Undying, and then at that point you get 2. Gothmog is in there to give a little bit of hitting power, but at the same time he allows me to, if I go up against men, I get +1 to wound with anybody within 3 inches. And then also Master of Battle, so I can counter some heroic moves, and maybe you lose a little bit of might, so that I can take advantage of that. With my 11 might, I should be advantage with Master of Battle as well. But then also he has the ability to make all of my orcs within 12 inches reroll to wound. So if I can get that on a good turn, I can really destroy one part of an army. Gorbag is 3 might heroic strike, and if I can get him in on 2 guys, he'll be fight 5 with 3 attacks. Always a good little person. And then Guritz obviously is there for the deployment, and then also is 3 might with heroic moves or heroic marches. And then, to be fair, if I can get him in on a good situation, he can go up to strength 6 with +1 to wound if he were to 2-handed piercing strikes. So he can, if I were to get a good trap off, I could actually do a lot of damage with Guritz on someone who was trapped. But yeah, it's 11 might, 52 models. Ability to move anywhere with the drum, because a lot of people will be in range. I guess my main idea would be to kind of deploy on one part of the board, and if I needed to go wide to get to other parts, I could, but I could control 2 areas of the board, and then maybe move to the right or the left when needed. If people wanted to deploy in all 4 sectors, then I can take care of one area and another area, and then move on to the rest. But what do you guys think?
So I like this as a build. I think this is an alternate build. Let me kind of talk through the strategy I would use with this. And I think what I would try and do with this is I would capitalize on the drummer that you have. And I would try and deploy this as close as I can together, in a ball, just to kind of maximize your combat power in one place. And then I would use the drum. I wouldn't even care about fighting the enemy. Unless the enemy came to me. And I would use the drum, and I would just move the ball into the middle of the board. And once I move the ball into the middle of the board, I would, kind of create a halo of guys, basically like a ring with the drum somewhere in the middle. And I would sit there, and I would let the opponent come to me, and somewhere, and, if he comes to me, then I would, beat him, because I got a lot of guys, and I can, set up basically a nice circular shield wall there where necessary. And then when it comes near the end of the game, I would just make sure that I've got, this 6-inch radius ring or 12-inch diameter ring in the middle of the board. And then I would beat the drum, and then I've got enough move to send all my guys out in all 3 directions or 4 directions if I want, and basically occupy all 4 of the quadrants. Because the advantage that the drum has over March is that the March can only go in one direction. You have to end up within 6 inches of the guy that called the March. Not true with the drum. So you put the drum in the middle of the board, and as long as he's got like this ring of guys around him, he can beat the drum, and then everybody scatters and everybody goes to each of the quadrants. And if you time that right, you've got enough guys in this list that you can probably grab 3 of the quadrants right there. And I think that's the strategy with this particular army.
So what if your opponent has Legolas and takes out the drum and?
Well, that blows the strategy, doesn't it? I think if that happens, you got to try and figure out a tactic with the Undying to take Legolas out.
Well, okay, so let's say they just have regular shooting in general. Like, you're holding off in the middle with a circle, and each warband has 4 bows. So you're waiting for them to come to you, but they can just shoot you. How are you dealing with that?
Well, I mean, you send some guys after the bows. I mean, you've got enough figures so that you can have like Gothmog and Gothmog in the Undying, and maybe Gorbag and a bunch of guys go and kind of take on the bows, and then have enough guys kind of left over in the middle, or even have the drummer kind of hang back and still do. I mean, you can still do this kind of starburst strategy from somewhere other than the center of the board. So, you can send a good chunk of your army to go fight the bows in like one corner of the board, and then do a starburst from there and still grab the other 3 quadrants at the end.
Would you guys do the same thing, or do you think that it would be better in another way?
I think I'd probably do a similar thing. By the way, I absolutely love the Starburst strategy. I'm calling it that from now on, and I am never changing it. That's incredible. Anyways,
you heard it here, folks. You heard it here first, folks.
Our supernova strategy. Yes.
I think that this list highlights a completely different way of playing this scenario, and something that maybe players who aren't as experienced in the scenario may not want to do, because I think there was like an interview or something with Jay Clare where Jay was saying, well, we saw that everybody wanted to just run into the middle and grind it out there, and then they ran off to the objectives, and we wanted to stop that. But you can still use that strategy to relatively strong effectiveness in this scenario, as long as you have a plan of getting to the objectives eventually, because the only thing you really need to do is get onto the objectives in the last turn. It's safer if you just stay on the objectives, but if you know what you're doing, you can not spend a single turn of the game on the objectives, and then as long as you get there on the last turn, you still win the game.
It's a bit similar in a way to the way Rohan or Rivendell would play if you were to keep yourself in the center, except with the Mordor list, you only have very few bows, so you can't really force your opponent's hand. So if they're out shooting you heavily, then you may be then forced to change strategy.
Yeah, I mean, you're not required to like stay in the middle and be completely inactive. As long, I mean, you go to the middle, or you go after your opponent, and then you use the drum to do the scatter afterwards, and you can scatter from various points on the board after you've engaged the bows, whatever. What's interesting as I'm thinking about it, the ideal army to implement this strategy is all mounted Easterlings, right? you buy a whole bunch of Easterling cataphracts, you buy Amdur, you put Kamul on a Felbeast, and then you have a drum, you have the Easterling cataphract drum, or even two of them, and you just run this defense 6 cavalry or defense 7/6 cavalry ball to the middle, because they're all getting the what is it, the Gleaming Horde special rule, the one where they get shield wall while they're mounted, and then they can go 15 inches in any direction from there.
Yeah. So if you want to be the first person in the world to use all mounted Easterlings and use them in this scenario, then please send us like a picture or something, because we want to see it.
Yeah.
I want to do this now. I want to go buy Easterlings now and do this.
Well, I've got enough, not painted, but I've got enough Easterling cataphracts unpainted to do this. So maybe I'll like sit down and dedicate like 2 months of my life to painting Easterling cataphracts. So I can do it.
Now, warning, your army is going to suck in every single other scenario, but in this scenario,
I don't know.
Great.
You heard it here first. Hashtag all mounted Easterlings. Well, I shouldn't say you heard it here first. I think there are people who play all mounted Easterlings. I think that has been done.
I'm sure there are.
And and I think there are some arguments for it. But
I would just love to see, like, how people do like front rank, back rank of like spear and shield. You just do that with cavalry instead. You just have like Suladon in the back giving a 6-inch banner.
I mean, I have to say, we did a few weeks ago on Halloween, we did Pelennor Fields, and Pelennor Fields has in it Amdur and a dozen Easterling cataphracts. And I have to say, at least against something like Rohan, a dozen Easterling cataphracts are a really big problem. Because Rohan does not want to fight an Easterling cataphract in a one-on-one cavalry duel, especially when there's lots of them, and and the Easterlings can engage them someplace. Either they're black dragons, which they weren't in this scenario, but this scenario there were enough Rohans so that it was away from the Theoden fight 4 bonus. And if you're on equal fight value terms with an Easterling cataphract and you're Rohan, you're in some trouble, especially if they can, when the leaders come up, they can fight in ranks so that you can only kill them on 6s. So they, Easterling cataphracts in numbers have some advantages that they don't have when there's, you've only got like 3 of them.
So are we then taking bets on how quickly Easterling cataphracts are going to sell out before Christmas?
I think we should make it like a mission. Like if we sell out the Easterling cataphracts, we'll do this episode. I would just love to see, like, everybody sends in the comments. They just send us the picture of their order of how many cataphracts they have, and
I mean, I don't have to do. I think I've got something like 20 unpainted Easterling cataphracts that I could pull off and paint. So.
I really, really want to do like a Harad Easterling all cav thing now, like that. Just Amdur and Suladon, and that'd be so much fun. But as for what we were actually talking about,
but we digress.
Yeah, we have a tendency to do that. But other than that, I think the great thing about this list, I think, is it wouldn't do well against Evan's list, but I think what's good about it for this scenario is, like Matt said, you can with the drum at any point you can move 9 inches in any direction and not be stuck staying with people. And if I need to, I have the 12 inches towards one direction with Guritz if I need to really go that far. I have a decent killing options with Gothmog, and Gorbag, if he can get into 2 people, will be really good. I have a lot of might. You won't get any leader points off of me, more than likely. And it'll just be, it kind of covers every base in a sense where, you have a lot of models. So if you come up against hordes, it's not that you'll, beat the horde, but you can do better against it. You can afford to deploy in different areas if you need to. I think it just kind of covers a lot of bases rather than, you have to play it this way kind of a thing. So it kind of lets you be more flexible. But let us know in the comment section below if you agree with any of what we said. If you have any disagreements, leave those as well so we can look over those. Let us know any lists in the comment section below that you'd like us to review and any other topics you'd like us to review for future episodes. We look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.